All night long I stood on the deck of the French ship Mariana watching the gangplanks. The long levee was crowded, and parties lasted late in the lavish staterooms, the decks rumbling with passengers and guests. But finally, as the hours moved towards dawn, the parties were over one by one, and carriages left the narrow riverfront streets. A few late passengers came aboard. A couple lingered for hours at the rail nearby, but Lestat and his apprentice, if they survived the fire, and I was convinced that they had, did not find their way to the ship. Our luggage had left the flat that day, and if anything had remained to let them know our destination, I was sure it had been destroyed. Yet still I watched. Claudia sat securely locked in our stateroom, her eyes fixed on the porthole. But Lestat did not come. Finally, as I'd hoped, the commotion of putting out commenced before daylight. A few people waved from the pier and the grassy hump of the levee as the great ship began first to shiver, then to jerk violently to one side, and then to slide out in one great majestic motion into the current of the Mississippi. The lights of New Orleans grew small and dim until they appeared behind us only a pale phosphorescence against the lightening clouds. I was fatigued beyond my worst memory, yet I stood on the deck for as long as I could see that light, knowing that I might never see it again. In moments we were carried downstream past the piers of Frenières and Pointe du Lac, and then, as I could see the great wall of cottonwood and cypress growing green out of the darkness along the shore, I knew it was almost morning. Too perilously close. And as I put the key into the lock of the cabin, I felt the greatest exhaustion perhaps that I'd ever known. Never in all the years I'd lived in our select family had I known the fear I'd experienced tonight, the vulnerability, the sheer terror. And there was to be no sudden relief from it, no sudden sense of safety, only that relief which weariness at last imposes, when neither mind nor body can endure the terror any longer. For though Lestat was now miles away from us, he had in his resurrection awakened in me a tangle of complex fears which I could not escape. Even as Claudia said to me, "We're safe, Louis, safe," and I whispered the word yes to her, I could see Lestat hanging in the doorway, see those bulbous eyes, that scarred flesh. How had he come back? How had he triumphed over death? How could any creature have survived that shriveled ruin he'd become? Whatever the answer, what did it mean, not only for him but for Claudia, for me? Safe from him we were, but safe from ourselves? The ship was struck by a strange fever. It was amazingly clean of vermin, however, though occasionally their bodies might be found. It was amazingly clean of vermin, however, though occasionally their bodies might be found, weightless and dry, as if the creatures had been dead for days. Yet there was this fever. It struck a passenger first in the form of weakness and a soreness about the throat. Occasionally there were marks there, and occasionally the marks were someplace else, or sometimes there were no recognizable marks at all, though an old wound was reopened and painful again. And sometimes the passenger who fell to sleeping more and more as the voyage progressed and the fever progressed died in his sleep. So there were burials at sea on several occasions as we crossed the Atlantic. Naturally afraid of fever, I shunned the passengers, did not wish to join them in the smoking room, get to know their stories, hear their dreams and expectations. I took my meals alone. But Claudia liked to watch the passengers, to stay on deck and see them come and go in the early evening, to say softly to me later as I sat at the porthole, "I think she'll fall prey." I would put the book down and look out the porthole, feeling the gentle rocking of the sea, seeing the stars, more clear and brilliant than we had ever been on land, dipping down to touch the waves. It seemed at moments, when I sat alone in the dark stateroom, that the sky had come down to meet the sea, and that some great secret was to be revealed in that meeting, some great gulf miraculously closed forever. But who was to make this revelation when the sky and sea became indistinguishable and neither any longer was chaos? God or Satan? It struck me suddenly what consolation it would be to know Satan, to look upon his face, no matter how terrible that countenance was, to know that I belonged to him totally, and thus put to rest forever the torment of this ignorance, to step through some veil that would forever separate me from all that I called human nature. I felt the ship moving closer and closer to this secret. There was no visible end to the firmament. It closed about us with breathtaking beauty and silence. But then the words "put to rest" became horrible, because there would be no rest in damnation, could be no rest. And what was this torment compared to the restless fires of hell? The sea rocking beneath those constant stars, those stars themselves, what had this to do with Satan? And those images which sound so static to us in childhood, when we were all so taken up with mortal frenzy that we can scarce imagine them desirable, seraphim gazing forever upon the face of God, and the face of God itself. This was rest eternal, of which this gentle cradling sea was only the faintest promise. But even in these moments, when the ship slept and all the world slept, neither heaven nor hell seemed more than a tormenting fancy. To know, to believe in one or the other, that was the only salvation for which I could dream. Claudia, with Lestat's liking for light, lit the lamps when she rose. She had a marvelous pack of playing cards, acquired from a lady on board. The picture cards were in the fashion of Marie Antoinette, and the backs of the cards bore gold fleur-de-lis, I think that's how that's pronounced, on gleaming violet. She played a game of solitaire in which the cards made the numbers of a clock, and she asked me until I finally began to answer her how Lestat had accomplished it. She was no longer shaken. If she remembered her screams in the fire, she did not care to dwell on them. If she remembered that, before the fire, she had wept real tears in my arms, it made no change in her. She was, as always in the past, a person of little indecision, a person for whom habitual quiet did not mean anxiety or regret. "We should have burned him," she said. "We were fools to think from his appearance that he was dead." "But how could he have survived?" I asked her. "You saw him. You know what became of him." I had no taste for it, really. I would have gladly pushed it to the back of my mind, but my mind would not allow me to. And it was she who gave me the answers now, for the dialogue was really with herself. "Suppose, though, he had ceased to fight us," she explained, "that he was still living, locked in that helpless, dried corpse, conscious and calculating." "Conscious in that state," I whispered. "And suppose when he reached the swamp waters and heard the sounds of our carriage going away, that he had strength enough to propel those limbs to move. There were creatures all around him in the dark. I saw him once rip the head of a small garden lizard and watch the blood run down into a glass. Can you imagine the tenacity of the will to live in him? His hands groping in that water for anything that moved. The will to live. Tenacity, I murmured. Suppose it was something else. And then, when he'd felt the resuscitation of his strength, just enough perhaps to have sustained him to the road, somewhere along that road he found someone. Perhaps he crouched, waiting for a passing carriage. Perhaps he crept, gathering still what blood he could until he came to the shacks of those immigrants or those scattered country houses. And what a spectacle he must have been. She gazed at the hanging lamp, her eyes narrow, her voice muted, without emotion. And then what did he do? It's clear to me. If he could not have gotten back to New Orleans in time, he could most definitely have reached the old Bayou Cemetery. The charity hospital feeds it fresh coffins every day, and I can see him clawing his way through the moist earth for such a coffin, dumping the fresh contents out in the swamps, and securing himself until the next nightfall in that shallow grave where no manner of man would be wont to disturb him. Yes, that is what he did, I'm certain. I thought of this for a long time, picturing it, seeing that it must have happened, and then I heard her add thoughtfully, as she laid down her card and looked at the oval face of the white coiffed king, I could have done it. And why do you look that... And why do you look that way at me? She asked, gathering up her cards, her small fingers struggling to make a neat pack of them and then to shuffle them. But do you believe that had we burned his remains he would have died? I asked. Of course I believe it. If there is nothing to rise, there is nothing to rise. What are you driving at? She was dealing out the cards now, dealing a hand for me on the small oak table. I looked at the cards, but I did not touch them. I don't know, I whispered to her. Only that perhaps there was no will to live, no tenacity, because very simply there was no need of either. Her eyes gazed at me steadily, giving no hint of her thoughts or that she understood mine. Because perhaps he was truly incapable of dying. Perhaps he is, as we are, truly immortal. For a long time she sat there looking at me. Consciousness in that state, I finally added as I looked away from her. If it were so, then mightn't there be consciousness in any other? Fire, sunlight, what does it matter? Louis, she said, her voice soft. You're afraid. You don't stand on guard against fear. You don't understand the danger of fear itself. We'll know these answers when we find those who can tell us, those who've possessed knowledge for centuries. For however long creatures such as ourselves have walked the earth, that knowledge was our birthright, and he deprived us. He earned his death. But he didn't die, I said. He's dead, she said. No one could have escaped that house unless they'd run with us, at our very side. No, he's dead. And so is that trembling aesthete, his friend. Consciousness. What does it matter? She gathered up the cards and put them aside, gesturing for me to hand her the books from the table beside the bunk, those books which she'd unpacked immediately on board, the few select records of vampire lore which she'd taken to be her guides. They indulged no wild romances from England, no stories of Edgar Allan Poe, no fancy, only those few accounts of the vampires of Eastern Europe, which had become her sort of Bible. In those countries, indeed, they did burn the remains of the vampire when they found him, and the heart was staked and the head severed. She would read these now for hours, these ancient books which had been read and reread before they ever found their way across the Atlantic. They were travellers' tales, the accounts of priests and scholars, and she would plan our trip not with the need of any pen or paper, only in her mind, a trip that would take us at once away from the glittering capitals of Europe towards the Black Sea, where we would dock at Varna and begin that search in the rural countryside of the Carpathians. For me it was a grim prospect, bound as I was to it, for there were longings in me for other places and other knowledge which Claudia did not begin to comprehend. Seeds of these longings had been planted in me years ago, seeds which came to bitter flowers as our ship passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. Seeds which came to bitter flower as our ship passed through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. I wanted those waters to be blue, and they were not. They were the nighttime waters, and how I suffered then, straining to remember the seas that a young man's untortured senses had taken for granted, that an undisciplined memory had let slip away for eternity. The Mediterranean was black, black off the coast of Italy, black off the coast of Greece, black always, black when, in the small cold hours, before dawn, as even Claudia slept, weary of her books and the meagre fire that caution allowed her vampire hunger, I lowered a lantern down through the rising vapor until the fire blazed right over the lapping waters, and nothing came to light on the heaving surface but the light itself, the reflection of that beam traveling constant with me, a steady eye which seemed to fix on me from the depths and say, "Louis, your quest is for darkness only. This sea is not your sea. The myths of men are not your myths. Men's treasures are not yours." But oh, how the quest for the old world vampires filled me with bitterness in those moments. A bitterness I could all but taste, as if the very air had lost its freshness. For what secrets, what truths had these monstrous creatures of night to give us? What, of necessity, must be their terrible limits, if indeed we were to find them at all? What can the damned really say to the damned? I never stepped ashore at Piraeus. Yet in my mind I roamed the Acropolis at Athens, watched the moon rise through the open roof of the Parthenon, measuring my height by the grandeur of those columns, walking the streets of those Greeks who died at Marathon, listening to the sound of the wind in the ancient olives. These were the monuments of men who could not die, not the stones of the living dead. Here the secrets that had endured the passage of time, which I had only dimly begun to understand. And yet nothing turned me from our quest, and nothing could turn me, but over and over, committed as I was, I pondered the great risk of our questions, the risk of any question that is truthfully asked, for the answer must carry an incalculable price, a tragic danger. Who knew that better than I, who had presided over the death of my own body, seeing all I called human wither and die, only to form an unbreakable chain which held me fast to this world, yet made me forever its exile, a spectre with a beating heart. The sea lulled me to bad dreams, to sharp remembrances. A winter night in New Orleans, when I wandered through the St. Louis cemetery and saw my sister, old and bent, a bouquet of white roses in her arms, the thorns carefully bound in an old parchment, her grey head bowed, her steps carrying her steadily along through the perilous dark to the grave where the stone of her brother Louis was set, side by side with that of his younger brother. Louis, who had died in the fire of Point du Lac, leaving a generous legacy to the godchild and namesake she never knew. Those flowers were for Louis, as if it had not been half a century since his death, as if her memory, like Louis's memory, left her no peace. Sorrow sharpened her ashen beauty. Sorrow bent her narrow back. And what I would not have given, as I watched her, to touch her silver hair, to whisper love to her, if love could not have loosed on her remaining years a horror worse than grief. I left her with grief, over and over and over. And I dreamed now too much. I dreamed too long. In the prison of this ship, in the prison of my body, attuned as it was to the rise of every sun as no mortal body had ever been, and my heart beat faster for the mountains of Eastern Europe, finally beat faster for the one hope that somewhere we might find in that primitive countryside the answer to why under God this suffering was allowed to exist, why under God it was allowed to begin, and how under God it might be ended. I had not the courage to end it. I knew without that answer, and in time the waters of the Mediterranean became, in fact, the waters of the Black Sea. The vampire sighed. The boy was resting on his elbow, his face cradled in his right palm, and his avid expression was incongruous with the redness of his eyes. "Do you think I'm playing with you?" the vampire asked, his fine, dark eyebrows knitted for an instant. "No," the boy said quickly. "I know better than to ask you any more questions. You'll tell me everything in your own time. and his mouth settled, and he looked at the vampire as though he were ready for him to begin again. There was a sound then from far off. It came from somewhere in the old Victorian building around them, the first such sound they'd heard. The boy looked up towards the hallway door. It was as if he'd forgotten the building existed. Someone walked heavily on the old boards, but the vampire was undisturbed. He looked away as if he were again disengaging himself from the present. That village. I can't tell you the name of it. The name's gone. I remember it was miles from the coast, however, and we'd been travelling alone by carriage. And such a carriage. It was Claudia's doing, that carriage, and I should have expected it. But then, things are always taking me unawares. From the first moment we arrived in Varna, I had perceived certain changes in her which made me at once aware she was Lestat's daughter as well as my own. From me she had learned the value of money, but from Lestat she had inherited a passion for spending it, and she wasn't to leave without the most luxurious black coach we could manage, outfitted with leather seats that might have accommodated a band of travellers, let alone a man and a child who used the magnificent compartment only for the transportation of an ornately carved oak chest. To the back were strapped 2 trunks of the finest clothes the shops there could provide. To the back were strapped 2 trunks of the finest clothes the shops there could provide, and we went speeding along, those light, enormous wheels and fine springs carrying that bulk with a frightening ease over the mountain roads. There was a thrill to that when there was nothing else in this strange country, those horses at a gallop and the gentle listing of that carriage. And it was a strange country, lonely, dark, as rural country is always dark, its castles and ruins often obscured. When the moon passed behind the clouds, so that I felt an anxiety during those hours. I'd never quite experienced in New Orleans. Sorry, I'm really all over the place today. So that I felt an anxiety during those hours I'd never quite experienced in New Orleans. And the people themselves were no relief. We were naked and lost in their tiny hamlets, and conscious always that amongst them we were in grave danger. Never in New Orleans had the kill to be disguised. The ravages of fever, plague, crime, these things competed with us always there, and outdid us. But here we had to go to great lengths to make the kill unnoticed, because these simple country people, who might have found the crowded streets of New Orleans terrifying, believed completely that the dead did walk and drink the blood of the living. They knew our names, vampire, devil, and we, who were on the lookout for the slightest rumor, wanted under no circumstances to create rumor ourselves. We travelled alone and fast and lavishly amongst them, struggling to be safe within our ostentation, finding talk of vampires all too cheap by the inn fires, where my daughter, sleeping peacefully against my chest. What? Sorry, this is a very strangely structured sentence. We travelled alone and fast and lavishly amongst them, struggling to be safe within our ostentation, finding talk of vampires all too cheap by the inn fires, where, my daughter sleeping peacefully against my chest, I invariably found someone amongst the peasants or guests who spoke enough German, or, at times, even French, to discuss with me the familiar legends. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, that's another small section of Interview with the Vampire. Let's talk about some of the things that went on today. First thing I should note, and something I've been meaning to mention the entire time I've been reading through this book, is that in regards to Anne Rice's writing style, Anne Rice loves her long words and she loves her run-on sentences, which occasionally means that sentences are structured very strangely. And it occasionally means that while I'm reading it aloud, it looks like a sentence ends or a character is still speaking or changes who's speaking while I'm going, and I sometimes misread what's on the page just because of the way it's structured and because of my own ineptitude. Sorry about that. It just happens. It could obviously be solved by a more rigorous editing process, but that's not what this is about. This is just about a casual reading. And so it's what you get. But that's the style Anne Rice has. And it's not bad, it's just sometimes difficult to read aloud. Anyway, we have, first off today, the boat journey. I hinted towards this ages ago, back when Lestat was talking to Louis about boats. And once again, we have this obvious parallel to Dracula, where Dracula himself goes on a boat journey in order to reach London. And they're reversing this process, going on a boat journey to reach Eastern Europe, as opposed to the other way around. What's interesting here is that for the original parallel to Dracula was in Lestat suggesting that they feed on rats in order to survive. And obviously they do, to a degree, feed on rats while on this boat. But they also ignored his advice, essentially, deciding instead that they're just going to feed off of humans sparsely, but almost as normal, in order to sustain themselves whilst on the boat. Regardless of this, they are still covert in their efforts, essentially. You know, they disguise it as a fever. And when I say they disguise it as a fever, it's not really because of any explicit effort they make. It just seems to be that people don't notice it. They don't notice anything unusual going on with people having, mysterious marks on their neck, old wounds reopening. And I get that the text is kind of trying to make a point about Western quote-unquote rationalism in regards to this, and them just not being willing to believe, that notion that the vampire's greatest strength is the fact that nobody will believe in them. And it's relatively okay at doing that. It's just, it becomes a bit iffy in regards to then the superstitious people being able to identify it, primarily because they lack Western civilization, which we'll get onto in a bit, but we've already discussed regarding the slaves, and there's definitely a bit more to talk about in regards to the inhabitants of Eastern Europe in that regard. But it is definitely the case that in the boat journey they are much more covert than Dracula's boat journey, in which every night he just comes up and eats someone / throws them overboard / whatever he does to them. He kills a lot of people on that boat to the point where everyone dies. This is a much more sneaky consumption on this boat. So they've listened to Lestat to a degree, if they haven't taken all of his advice on board. Anyway, main chunk of what goes on here is some good old classic Louis existentialism, consciousness, and talking about immortality. Because basically what we have here is Louis is thinking about Lestat. And he's thinking about the fact that Lestat was supposed to be dead, and then he just came back within a relatively short period of time. And what Louis concludes here is that he is afraid that he can't actually die at all, and that even if he were to be destroyed, his consciousness will remain and will have to suffer, now even more so because it lacks a body, and that he never will get a answer, quote unquote, as to what occurs after death, because he is truly locked off from death. It's not just that he won't die naturally, it's that he cannot die at all. And that's a reasonable enough fear for Louis to have, because even if he is, immortal and he won't die of old age, statistically, after a long enough period of time, eventually something is going to happen to him that would quote-unquote kill him. He'll get careless one morning and get exposed to the sun. He'll be found by someone who'll burn him up. He'll get, his head cut off, that kind of thing. And then he's worried that if that were to ever happen, he would just be a kind of disembodied consciousness suffering forever, which sounds pretty bad. It's a pretty bad thing to imagine. And this leads him deeper into his existentialism and depression, essentially, because he just doesn't know what's going to happen to him. And in regards to this, he's kind of forced to confront the mortality that he abandoned when he's dreaming on the boat and he remembers his sister. And he remembers the genuine grief his sister experienced regarding his death, or his supposed death, even 50 years on, seeing her in the cemetery at his grave, laying flowers. And he just, it's not really something he understands. It's as though he has been dead for that period of time, but he's been still conscious. So in a way, he has to reckon with that notion of, not being able to die, not being able to pass on, never truly being able to get an answer to the question he has, which is, does God exist? I think. So what this really becomes is he just wants to know his own purpose. He wants to know what's going on with the universe. Even if that means he is a servant of the devil, he just wants to know that the devil is real so that he can give his life some meaning. And the tragic answer to this question, as we're going to discuss again and again in this novel, and we're going to have a very good line about coming up relatively soon, it's that purpose doesn't actually exist. There, as far as anyone can tell, is no greater meaning to existence. And as such, Louis is faced with the terrifying burden of finding his own meaning in existence and providing himself with his purpose, because no external source is able to do that for him. And of course, this makes Louis very sad, and so he just kills people instead. His purpose becomes this searching for unattainable purpose. And it's all very angsty and very existential and really interesting and cool, and I love it. But you can see Louis' kind of central tragedy and ineptitude in the fact that he is never quite accepting that he isn't forced to act the way he does. He's under the impression that for some reason he must act and must serve in these morally abhorrent ways, when he is not bound to in any way, and nothing means anything, so he can just not be bad, even if bad doesn't technically exist. I mean, I don't care that bad doesn't technically exist. If you're going around killing people, you're still a bad person in my mind. Objective morality, yeah, sure, there is no objective morality. Everything is subjective. Nothing means anything. Stop being such a dick about it is really my answer to that. Just be nice to people. It's not that hard. Anyway, Claudia we also have here. And Claudia is taking an approach to the vampiric condition that is basically a polar opposite of Louis' approach. Claudia is taking a very scientific approach to vampirism, whereas Louis is taking a more philosophical route. Claudia is researching, she's gathering evidence, she's trying to find answers so that she can solve things. Whereas Louis is far more interested in dwelling on the nature of existence and walking around the Parthenon and looking at ancient great artifacts and thinking of the fact that the men who made them are dead, yet are not dead because of the fact that those artifacts still exist. But we see an example of Claudia kind of learning when she learns about the fire. And she adds it to her knowledge. I talked about the fire last episode, and this is just kind of an extension, and that Claudia has concluded now that fire is necessary to kill vampires. And she is convinced that the fire has killed Lestat, and that Lestat is now truly dead. The curious thing in this regard is that I think Claudia is unable of believing that Lestat is still alive, more so than she simply just doesn't believe that Lestat is alive. Because if Claudia even contemplates the notion of Lestat being still alive, then she is forced to reckon with these philosophical notions that Louis keeps bringing up. She's forced to reckon with the possibility of true immortality, of meaninglessness in existence, and all of that very, very depressing all of those very depressing notions. And so instead of contemplating it, she just kind of shuts it out and instead tries to seek more empirical answers to vampiric problems and aims to find other vampires in order to ask them specific questions, to learn from them, in contrary to Louis' approach. We also see with Claudia in this section, she has adopted Lestat's lavish spending habits. Unsurprising, it just, I think, once again, to me, puts forward the notion that Claudia is filling Lestat's role. She has fully taken on Lestat's mantle, and she is now acting as he would, in many regards, in controlling Louis. And I think another reason that Claudia is not willing to contemplate the notion of Lestat still being alive is the fact that she is deeply, deeply, perhaps unconsciously afraid of Lestat returning and filling that role once again, and leaving her once more subservient, or even worse, outcast/dead. So yeah, there's that. Final point to consider in this regard, and this is something we're going to talk a bit more about as we get better instances to talk about it, but it should be addressed as it's come up. And that is this returning notion of quote-unquote primitive peoples being able to identify vampires because of their superstitious nature. And this being a kind of noble superstition, despite the fact that any white character who is portrayed as being superstitious is being portrayed as an idiot. Make of that what you will. It's a bit more of the kind of, I think, just probably unconscious exoticism that Anne Rice injects into this text, where just really, really desperate after all of these lavish cultures that are not her own, and she portrays them in ways that are, I think, a bit iffy. And I think the main reason that this notion of quote-unquote savage cultures being able to identify vampires easily is that, given the right conditions, I think anyone will be able to start believing in supernatural events and occurrences and identify a vampire for what it is. The reason Louis Lestat and Claudia, and vampires in general, were able to get along and survive in those major metropolitan cities. Sorry, I don't even think metropolitan is the right word. I don't quite know what metropolitan actually means, but those major cities, is because of the fact that those cities create conditions in which their behavior is not as noticeable. I don't think it's anything particularly about people that makes them identify or not identify vampires. I think culturally, even someone who is very rational will recognize that there is something unusual going on if people start suddenly dropping dead every night with mysterious bite marks in their neck. I don't think they're just going to go, oh, it's a mysterious new fever. I think they're probably going to think something is killing them, even if they don't immediately think it's a vampire. And the reason that in cities they don't get noticed is because this mass industrialization and mass exploitation that is occurring within these cities due to overcrowding, poor working conditions, poor hygiene standards, and whatnot, it leads to a mass death where people are not as concerned with the deaths as they occur, and they are much more happy to just throw the bodies away and not really regard them as significant events. The value of human life is cheapened under this mass industrialization and, in truth, just capitalism, essentially. Whereas in these more remote societies, which are, as Anne Rice, or I suppose Louis, I should be more fair, Louis is describing them as primitive, but, make of it what you will. I think it's not because they're quote-unquote primitive that they're able to identify vampires for what they are. It's because they live in smaller communities where people dying is rather notable, and if you can recognize common trends in those deaths, such as, bite marks on their necks, you will be quite quick to conclude, I think, that it is a vampire doing this, if you have knowledge of legends and folklore and whatnot. Or you will, at very least, even if you don't have that knowledge, you will conclude that something is going on. Something is doing this. These people aren't just dropping dead of fever when they have clear wounds, But, anyway, That's that. There are much better points to talk about, and I've kind of rambled on that point, and I don't think I've been as coherent as I need to be. Regardless, that is another section of Interview with the Vampire. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to get into some more fun Eastern European shenanigans in the next part, so I hope you'll stick around, and I'll see you next time.